Good afternoon, my beautiful people. I go by the name Sotadeology. In today's particular class, we're going to dissect Sotadeology lecture 20, faster than and light speed limit. Now, when you look at quantum entanglement, we have this phenomenon right in quantum entanglement, which is faster than the speed of light. And yet, Albert Einstein said that there is no speed that can be faster than the speed of light. So nothing travels at a speed that is, faster than the speed of light. So now today we're going to see what the likely solution is going to be by using formula of everything, and then use my published research theories. So that's what we're going to actually dive deeply into today. So now, with no further ado, let's dive into it. So I want to start with the true nature of time, light, and mass. Well, the reason I want to use this is we need to know what the nature of light is for us to be able to say if truly there is nothing that can move at a speed that is faster than the speed of light. Then what is the relationship of time to light? What is the relationship of mass to light? Those are the things that we're going to actually dissect. So now, before the time of Michael Faraday, scientists were treating, forces as something that is, treating forces as things that are separate. You understand? So if you have the banging of door, they would actually see it as a force. And then if you hear the cracking of thunder, it's another force. So there is nothing like unification to all these forces to say that indeed they can be, classified as something known as energy. But then Michael Faraday, he conducted an experiment, with light. He actually plugged a wire to battery and then placed compass around the wire to see the compass moving perpendicular to the momentum of the current in the wire. And then with that, it was able to come up with electromagnetic wave. And that is why you see that here we have energy. What is the definition of energy? Energy is a thermodynamic quantity equivalent to the capacity of a physical system to do work. I'll say it again. What is energy? Energy is a thermodynamic quantity equivalent to the capacity of a physical system to do work. Now, when something is said to be thermodynamic, it simply means that it can actually or easily be transformed into gaseous element or to solid element, or rather liquid element. So now, for us to quantify what energy is, we can actually use this diagram that I have below, which is electromagnetic wave. So I'm not a good artist, so this might not be the genuine representation of electromagnetic wave, but basically the magnetic field is actually traveling perpendicular to the electric field. And so we have this, you can see the direction of that momentum from left to right. So that is that. Then mass, the property of a body that causes something to have weight in a gravitational field. So it's a property of a body, and a body is something that has weight. Something that has weight. So now, what this is telling us is that by the virtue of actually gravitating towards the central point, then that would allow that something that we're talking about to accumulate weight, and so it can be a body in the universe. Now, mass is highly essential because before you can quantify something in the universe, it has to be mass inclined, and that is why we have this. But basically, for us to know what the nature of mass is not something like, it's not something solid as we normally, visualize it to be, or as we normally envisage it to be. It's more or less like strands of energy that is being spirally formed towards the central point, as what we have right here. Now, when you look at the outermost layer of this convergence, that is the mass density, and it is synonymous to the Earth as we have it. Then the inner layer, we have another spiral formation in red, and that is energy density, which is towards the central point. And so the formation is that the outermost layer will be more solid than the innermost region. So we have some trait of instability right there, and that is why we could have lava ejecting from the core singularity of Earth to cause the phenomenon known as earthquake. So that is that. Then we have another kind of mass convergence in the universe, which I call sun. The outermost layer of sun is energy density, because the outermost is not that stable, and so we could have ejection of solar wind, then solar corona and things like that. Okay, so now the innermost of the sun will be more solid than the outermost region, so we have that to be mass density. So now, time. What is time? Now, I'm going to define time based on my novel research discovery. So I call it the electromagnetic speed of relativity scaling. You will get to know why the definition is like this, because time is something in the universe that ensures the balance momentum in the universe. And so we'll get to see that as we dissect this phenomenon further. But before I go further, I want to talk about energy and talk about time. Now, time has two identities. Time has two identities. The default identity is time is instant by default. But when time is in relativistic scaling with energy, it becomes continuous. Then energy has two identities as well. Energy is infinite by default, but when energy is in relativistic scaling with time, then it becomes discrete. So when you now consider the inverse relationship of time to energy, then we can see the feasibility of the fabric of the universe to be dynamic or flexible in that sense. And that is why we could have curvature of space-time, just as Albert Einstein proposed it. You understand? So now let's now dissect what kind of relationship we have between distance and time. But then before we do that, I want us to dissect this time energy wave model. So now, this is what I call time energy wave model. The blue curvature represents the trajectory of time, which is inversely related to the trajectory of energy. Now, when you look at formula of everything is what I have right here, which is the T the M equal to capital UM plus 4M. This is the formula I derived in my research publications. And this formula is so powerful that it fits back on itself. And what that means is that when you supply an input, the input will generate an output. Then you can use that generated output as input to further generate output. So now this formula, when we apply this formula, we're going to have this time energy wave model. And don't forget that the capital UM plus 4M that we have nested right inside the curvature, the T, the M, represents the curvature of time to energy, while the capital U is the constant speed of the universe. So the M, the two M's represent, the mass worth that we might want to input. You understand? So it could be quantum mass worth, it could be classical mass worth. So you can actually use what you know to get what you don't know. But then the 4 is a constant. It's a coefficient that will catapult that mass worth of this 4M into the realm of time. So I call this 4M weak conveying force, while this capital UM is strong conveying force. So now, for instance, let's say we specify this particular mass worth, which is the mass worth of electron, 9.109 times 10 raised to power minus 31 kilogram. If we should put that in the place of the 2 M's of the formula of everything, then we're going to get this classical counterpart, which is 2,277,250,000 kilogram. So now, when we now put this classical mass worth inside the formula of everything, the answer that we're going to get will be this 5.7 times 10 raised to power 48. Now, by having this, we know that the trajectory is at classical level. And so, how can we then get to solve this? We can get to solve this answer by expanding it in standard form. And so when we do that, we're going to have a couple of zeros to suspend the weak conveying value, which is the value of that 4M. It will suspend it, and that is, the big convergence that we have right here. So now, right here, so now the convergence of the weak conveying force is what we have right here. Now you can actually see that is being suspended to where we have the extreme end of the curvature of time. And then right up here, what do we have? We have compacted equilateral triangle. So now this is an equilateral triangle. This is another equilateral triangle. But then the suspension, we have it at 5.7 times 10 raised to power 32 right here, for us to manually annihilate the suspended zero, because what we have here is that we have the action of time to generate this diagonal linear trajectory for us, and that must as well have a reaction in energy, and that is why we could have this another diagonal linear trajectory. And so this represents the constancy of light, and what we have here represents the constancy of gravity. So now what we need to have should be this vertical trajectory. Now this vertical trajectory, we can only get it by traveling at the speed of time. Don't forget, I said time at its default state, it travels instantly. So now, by annihilating only the zeros, it means that we are traveling at the speed of time. And then when you look at this vertical trajectory, you can see that it is longer than normal. It is not stopped at the extreme end of that, equilateral limit. it travels even beyond the constraint of time, energy of this diagram. So what that is telling us is that we have connection to higher dimensions. So if we call this everything that if we call everything that we have here, if we call it 2D, then the higher dimension will be 3D. So now, how do we, annihilate the suspended zeros manually? So the base of electron that we have, which is suspended to that strong conveying force, is 9,109. So we don't have it in form of 9.109. So now when you take that over the 10 raised to power 32, then you are going to have it to be 9,109 all over 10 raised to power 32. If you expand that, then you're going to have 9.109 times 1 all over 10 raised to power 32. So if you now solve that further, your answer will now be 9.109 times 10 raised to power minus 32. So the value that we got is actually smaller compared to the initial mass worth of electron that we used, and that is actually showing that this vertical trajectory has been shifted forward into the black hole. So we have the effect of decay on that mass worth, and that is why we have that. But then, is it possible for us to have this vertical trajectory being sustained such that it generates standing wave that we connect to the higher dimension, for us to really have flipping mechanism that we allow this initial equilateral triangle to be flipped as what we have in the black hole? And that is what we're going to dissect. So now, to answer the reason we have, the reason we have that phenomenon of nothing in the universe that has mass can actually travel at the speed of light. To answer that, when you look at what we have here, I want you to focus on this vertical trajectory. You can see that we have a convergence of real classical mass worth, which is this value, but then we do not have the real quantum mass worth right inside the equilateral triangle, right in the region of quantum mechanics. But then you can see that since the suspension is 5.7 times 10 raised to power minus 32, that value is smaller compared to the mass worth of electrons. So electron mass worth will actually be right inside this compacted equilateral triangle. And this compacted equilateral triangle, that is what I call the nucleus. So we have one nucleus right here, which is the nucleus of the future. Then if you look up, there is another nucleus. There is another compacted equilateral triangle, which I call the nucleus of the past. Don't forget that the Schwarzschild solution to general relativity generates two singularities. There is one at the edge and there is one at the central point. So these are the two singularities as we have in that solution. So now you can now see that I have an empty circle right here inside this compacted equilateral triangle. What that is telling us is that electron is undefined. So what that is telling us is that electron is undefined right inside the nucleus. But then we have this standing wave, which we have this standing wave. We have this trajectory that connects to higher dimension, to connect to the electron of the higher dimension. So we have this trajectory that connects to the mass worth of electron at higher dimension. which will be instantly converted to positron. And by having it to be positron, it will be attracted by the electron of the substrate. And so it will be integrated into the substrate dimension. It is when it is inserted into the substrate dimension that we have the shift, which we now see as 9.109 times 10 raised to power minus 32. But the electron mass worth that we have here is 9.109 times 10 raised to power minus 31 kilogram. So this is actually synonymous to the nuclear fission. You know, when you bombard a nucleus with a neutron, for instance, uranium, it's actually going to get bigger just for a tiny, I don't know, maybe nanoseconds or so. It will be increased, but it will just be increased for a short while. And then it will be broken into krypton and barium. You understand? So basically, we have that reduction when there is that shift. And we can only have that reduction of the quantum mass worth that when we have that injection into the substrate dimension. But then what we have here, the electron of the substrate to the electron of the higher dimension, which will be instantly converted to positron, what we have there is known as quantum entanglement. And you can see by the virtue of being at higher dimension and being at higher dimension, by the virtue of connecting to higher dimension, that is what we actually facilitate the instantiation of the substrate dimension. So this substrate dimension's electron wasn't initiated because of the huge temperature, pressure, and all that. But by connecting to higher dimension, then there will be higher free degree of freedom and power. And based on that relativistic connection or entanglement as we have it, then the higher dimensions electron will be instantiated and it will be instantly converted to positron. And then the moment this is then fused with this substrate dimension, then higher and substrate dimension will become one. So this is somehow related to the, research of the newly elected or newly awarded Nobel laureates for 2025 award in physics. What they did was to cool down. They cooled down electron up to the point that they have this unified identity, you understand, so as to be able to have it on quantum chip, you understand. So now, based on what we now have here, you can now see that based on what we now have here, you can then see that we have this standing wave, but I need to actually analyze how we were able to get the standing wave. If you should put this value, which is 5.7 times 10 raised to power minus 48, right inside the formula of everything, then you'll be able to track how we get mass accumulation towards this edge of the energy's curvature. And so we tend to have bigger mass worth. So all the mass accumulations as we have right here, I call them arbitrary mass worth because electron as at that time wasn't instantiated. So then that arbitrary mass worth is what we have in addition to the constantly contracting momentum towards the central point of this curved edge of energy. So basically in the nucleus, what we have is that we have constantly accelerating momentum. So what does that mean? That kind of momentum is synonymous to a kind of momentum you can have on a treadmill. You see that you are having momentum, but such momentum is not translated to a kind of movement from one point to another. So you are moving at one spot. So the kind of momentum that we have is somehow constant, even though it's a momentum, but then we have this attached variation to it, because don't forget that this compacted equilateral triangle is being vertically oriented, and it is because we have two equilateral triangles being stacked upon each other at this central vertical trajectory. So now, by having it to be in vertical orientation, it simply means that we have the contraction of gravitational field towards the contraction of electric field. So basically, there will be a point where the electric field contraction will be equal to the gravitational field contraction. And that is why we could have mass accumulation right inside the compacted equilateral triangle, which will be equal to the mass Watt decaying accumulation at a point, and that will generate standing wave, and it will project momentum into the higher dimension. So then you can see that quantum entanglement is able to transmit information at instant speed just because it has this connection to the higher dimension. And so even though there is feasibility of faster than the speed of light, we know that is not possible within the constraint of the substrate dimension. That can only be possible at the transiting point from substrate dimension to higher dimension. So now we have that. So that explains the reason we could have faster than the speed of light. But then if you look at it, the faster than the speed of light, it is only feasible via information transmission. So now let's look at this, because I needed to prove why we often have this infinite momentum. I want to prove how we often have, I want to prove the reason we often have this infinite momentum in the universe, and then prove the reason nothing can actually, travel faster than the speed of light within a dimensional limit. Okay, so now when you look at this, we have this classical mass worth being initiated right here, but then the arbitrary mass worth is what we have at the topmost, and I call that classical arbitrary suspension. So now what that means is that the contraction towards the central point generates this real classical mass worth, but then the reaction of that is what we have as this arbitrary mass worth. So definitely we must instantly have real mass worth to a reacting arbitrary mass worth. Okay, so now when you now look at this, you can see that there is no way we can get this, we can get the real identity of this real classical mass worth unless we get the real instantiation of the quantum mass worth. So now, when you look at this, you see that at this central trajectory, we're able to get the real location of the classical mass worth relative to the real position of the quantum mass worth. So by the virtue of this trajectory being vertical means that it is instant, but then we still have this elongation. If something is said to be instant, it has to be snappy. It shouldn't be elongated in any way, but because we have this kind of inverse relationship between time and energy, we have this elongation. And then the elongation is necessary because we must actually bridge this divergence of gravitational field to the electric field. The divergence as we have it can only be bridged when we have the elongation. So now the elongation as we have it can only be interpreted as a static and undulating field. Static and undulating field. Now that field, that is the field that I call reality field. So instant trajectory of time can actually travel through all dimensions. So now let's look at the reason we have this phenomenon of nothing can travel, or anything that has mass cannot travel faster than the speed of light. Now you see that at the point where we have the quantum instantiation, we have the instantiation of the classical mass worth to be suspended to the point of intersection of this vertical trajectory to the horizontal trajectory. So basically, what we have here is known as objective conscious experience. The feedback of that information, the feedback of this quantum mass worth location, which is at higher dimension, will be sent instantly back to this classical mass worth. And the point where we have this classical mass worth is not where the mass worth should be. And that is why we need that subjective conscious experience to relocate this classical mass worth to the point of this intersection of vertical trajectory to horizontal trajectory. So now, basically, we now see that at the point where we have reality, we see that at higher dimension, we can have this genuine contact, but then at classical level, we can't have genuine contact. What is the implication of that? The implication of that is that there is this trade-off in the universe. For instance, when you look at the formula of everything, there is no trait of quantum element. There is no trait of quantum element in that formula. But then, if you understand if you understand the phenomenon that we can actually call quantum mechanics to the phenomenon that we can actually call classical mechanics, you will understand that we do not need any element of quantum mechanics to have the formula that can actually shed light on the reality of the universe. What do I mean by that? Now, for instance, let's say there is somebody on Earth. Having this contact with Earth will make that person to believe that the Earth is flat. But then, the moment the person travels away from the Earth into the space to a certain distance, the person will actually see the full picture of the Earth, and then the person can get to see that the Earth is spherical. Earth is spherical. Okay? So by having that reality at that point, that will actually make that person to be deluded of the reality of people on Earth. Because at the point where the person could get the reality of the Earth, then the reality of the people on Earth will be delusional to that particular person. So there is this trade-off by the virtue of localization. There is no way you can be localized in at one point in the space and yet be localized at another point in space again. So that is why we usually have this phenomenon of having a genuine contact at one point, at one side, then have suspension at the other side. Now, the virtue of that suspension can be translated to infinite phenomenon, while the virtue of genuine contact can be translated as, instant contact, or genuine contact, you understand, or instant contact nature of time. Okay, so now by having this classical suspension to where it's supposed to be, then that means that indeed nothing of mass worth can actually travel faster than the speed of light. Because at a point where there is genuine contact, at quantum level, we're going to have suspension at classical level. This is somehow related, but not that related to uncertainty principle. You understand? Because in this case, we get to know the momentum, we get to know the position, but the issue that we have is just the issue of localization. And so we have this trade-off of having genuine contact one side, but have suspension at the other side. Okay, so now when you look at this, you can get to see that there is something that is common to both time and energy. Time cannot be measured relative to energy unless there is this arbitrary configuration of, or rather, let me say, time cannot be measured relative to energy without having arbitrary measure. So now arbitrary measure is what is actually used by time to collapse wave such that we can have connection to higher dimension, so as to have this vertical trajectory and to have it as the reality that we always dream of. Now, by having this reality, it is so clear that the moment we have mass convergence right inside the substrate dimension, there must be a kind of suspension. Now, this suspension we're talking about is so needed or so essential because there is no way you can get to say you have countably infinite momentum without having suspension. Cantor made us to realize that there is possibility for having a countably infinite situation, so that we can actually be able to work with infinity. So now if somebody tells you that there is a way you can get to number all natural numbers, then you just have to tell the person to add 1 to that number, and then you can keep on doing that, and what you have right there is infinity. So how can we get to have finite number? But then what I just said now, if you look at the formula is 2n plus 1, which is the formula of odd number. So odd number suspends phenomenon at higher dimension. But then what kind of suspension can we have within the substrate dimension that can ensure finite instantiation? So the kind of formula we can have will be 2n minus 1. So when you have suspension within the substrate dimension, you have that finite instantiation, and that is what we have for this real classical mass worth as something that is being suspended to the point of vertical trajectory to horizontal trajectory. Then don't forget that the horizontal trajectory, the dashed horizontal trajectory, that is the default trajectory of energy, and that is infinite. The vertical trajectory is the default trajectory of time, and that is instant. So now, by having the suspension, then it means that we have finite convergence, which is the classical mass worth as we have it. And then that is telling us that it can never be at a point where it can be genuinely in contact with light speed. So that is that. So now, you know that 2n, the formula of 2n, you know that we can translate that to be even number. So we often have this toggling or alternating effect of odd number to even number. And so we dissect that further as we progress. But then with this diagram, you can get to know that the reason we have the light speed limit to be the universal light speed is for the fact that within the substrate dimension, nothing of mass worth can actually travel at the speed of light. But then we have the feasibility of faster than the speed of light when there is transition from the substrate dimension to higher dimension. So the whole system of that transition is what I call complex system. So entanglement, quantum entanglement is possible because we have this transition from the substrate dimension to higher dimension. And because it's a kind of relationship between substrate to higher, which we can translate to, higher degree of freedom. So we could have the instantiation of electron relative to that positron of the higher dimension. And then don't forget that the positron of the higher dimension is not the actual positron of that substrate dimension. So the integration of that positron will not destroy the electron of the substrate dimension. It will rather propel momentum towards the core singularity of the black hole. Now, don't forget that the integration or the injection of that positron, which will propel momentum towards the core singularity of the black hole, and then at that core singularity of the black hole, we have the remnant of electron, because electron base value will have been decayed to 1.1. And that 1.1 worth of electron of that base remnant will be suspended right inside the core singularity of the black hole. So what we have there, we get this result by reiterating formula of everything. And then we realize that how do we get that? We get that by substituting the value of that generated quantum mass worth, which is 9.109 times 10 raised to power minus 32 kilogram. If we put that inside the formula of everything, then we will get we're going to get the classical counterpart, which will be decayed to 277,750,000 kilograms. So almost about 2 billion worth of mass worth is being decayed. Good. So now, by applying formula of everything, we can actually track, the decay value of quantum mass worth relative to decay value of classical mass worth. But then when you look at it, the decay of quantum mass worth is at power, and it is just a reduction of 1 at power. And that has led to about almost 2 billion worth of mass at classical level. But then if we put the newly generated classical mass worth, which is 277,750,000 kilograms, if we put that right inside the formula of everything, then we will realize that the power will be shifted forward. The power of the quantum mass worth will be shifted forward right from that minus 32nd to 31st. And then the base worth will be decayed down to 1.1. So the phenomenon that we have there is the phenomenon is synonymous to quasar signal. Quasar signal, the swing forth and back of quasar signal, that is what we have for electron right there, because we could have this swing forward from the minus 32 power to minus 31st power. Then we have this swing backward and forth by having the decay of the base worth of electron. So now, the moment we're going to have that suspension in the core singularity of the black hole, which is this area, then that will have relocated this classical mass worth to this point of vertical and horizontal trajectories. So what we have there is known as subjective conscious experience. So if I'm to briefly tell you about this objective conscious experience and a subjective conscious experience, objective conscious experience will allow the classical mass worth to be self-aware of its position relative to where it's supposed to be. And that awareness is as a result of having the quantum mass worth instantiation at higher dimension. So now you can see that by the virtue of quantum entanglement, we have interconnectivity from substrate dimension to higher dimension. So now the subjective conscious experience, we have to just relocate the classical mass worth from where it is, down to where it's supposed to be. So now there is no way we can have subjective conscious experience without having objective conscious experience. If we can't get to know the position of classical mass worth relative to where it's supposed to be, there will be no work for subjective conscious experience to relocate the mass worth to where it's supposed to be. So now those are the two faces to consciousness as being revealed by formula of everything. So now we know why we have the light speed limit to be the universal limit at substrate dimension, and then the reason we have the time limit to be the limit of interconnectivity of dimensions. So that is that. But then let's quickly dissect the relationship between distance and time. So by dissecting this, we get to know how time operates with energy, and we'll get to know why it is possible for us to have this spiral formation towards the central point. Okay, so now, but then let me quickly say this. For that objective conscious experience, we now get to know that this classical mass worth is undefined until we have this connection to the quantum mass worth of higher dimension. And because the classical mass worth is undefined, that is why we could call this big convergence, that is why we could call it classical arbitrary suspension. Don't forget that the mass accumulation right inside the compacted equilateral triangle, I call that to be arbitrary mass worth because electron of the substrate dimension as at that point wasn't defined. So now we have the instantiation of this classical mass worth the moment we have connection to that positron of the higher dimension. And basically what that is telling us is that we are only conscious of whatever it is that we can hold, just like look at me holding this marker right now. I'm able to hold this marker because as at the point I'm holding the marker, I'm already conscious of holding that marker. Now, what that means is that whatever we're trying to hold, or whatever it is that we are trying, yes, to hold as this, we can't hold that thing unless we have that instant transmission of that update from higher dimension. Because there is this repulsive force between what you are trying to hold and your hand. Whatever it is you want to hold, there is this repulsive force between that thing and your hand. So you only get conscious of what you heard by having that instant transmission of connectivity to the positron of higher dimension. So now let's look at the difference between, the relationship between distance and time. Now, Galileo conducted a particular experiment. Look at this ramp. He developed this ramp, and you can see that the ramp has measurement. But then what Galileo did was he generated an arbitrary measure, which is called Galileo. Then he now made that measure to be 1 unit worth of time reading. Now, he now tried to, he put the ball right at the topmost area, right here. Then he made the ball to travel right from this point, from this mark to where we have this 1. He now called that measure to be 1 Galileo, and that then happens to be 1 unit of time. But then he now did something. He placed the ball again right here at this edge. Now he started the clock, and then he used the 2 units of that time measure in order to gauge where the ball will stop. Now, instead for the ball to move from this edge and stop at this mark, the ball actually moved from this edge and then stopped at where we have 4. Then he did it again to measure 3 units of time relative to the distance that the ball will travel. But then the ball traveled right from here. Instead of stopping at this mark, then the ball stopped at the mark where we have 9. Now, with that, Galileo quickly realized that the relationship of time to distance is the distance that ball travel square. What do I mean by that? The distance the ball traveled, that worth of that distance will be squared. That is the worth measure of time relative to that arbitrary measure of Galileo. So now if you look at what I have right here, arbitrary clock, that is the arbitrary Galileo measure. Then the real clock is the time. So now 1 Galileo is the same thing as 1 squared in time measure. 2 Galileo is the same thing as 2 squared in time measure. 3 Galileo is the same thing as 3 squared in time measure. Now, by having this to be squared in time measure, then it tells us that time has variation by its measure, while the arbitrary has constancy by its measure. So what is the implication of that? The implication of that is that we often have this constancy to variation. We have this relationship of constancy to variation relationship. Time is relative, time is continuous, energy is discrete. And so that is actually proving what we have in this time energy wave model. But then the whole thing is somehow complex. Even though we have this symmetric nature of this equilateral triangle, what that is telling us is that by its operation, this symmetric nature of equilateral triangle is not actually symmetric. It is telling us that we have constancy at one side and we have variation at the other side. So now let's look at how this equilateral triangle operates. If we dissect the time slice, then we can get to know that by the virtue of energy being discrete, that will make the momentum of energy to be shorter to the momentum of time, because time is continuous. Time can easily flow and then move faster than energy in that sense. So that will make the trajectory of time slice to be tilted. That will tilt the trajectory of time slice like this. Good. So now, what that is telling us is that time is ahead of energy. And anytime time is ahead of energy, energy will cause mass convergence towards the time trajectory. But then when we look at if we were to dissect the operational mechanics of this equilateral triangle, we can see that at quantum level, we have mass decaying mechanism, which will support the mass accumulation mechanism at classical level. So by that, we can get to see that the equilateral triangle is not actually symmetric by operation. It is asymmetric. So I'm going to use the other diagram to dissect this asymmetric nature, the inherent asymmetric nature in the equilateral triangle. So now, another thing we need to know is that by the virtue of, I said something right here that we have compacted the equilateral triangle, and then because we have this angular momentum, because we have the most curved region to be the center of the nucleus. So the implication of that is that we're going to have angular momentum, and that is why we have constantly accelerating momentum or constantly accelerated momentum. Now, the implication of that is that by having that angular momentum, there will be influx of additional energy. So that additional energy must be translated to something that will not have effect for us to maintain that constantly accelerated momentum. But what that is being converted to is the arbitrary mass watt accumulation. But then we have this suspension of variation to it that we shrink the slice of time or shrink the progression of time such that we could, have the mass accumulation to align with the curvature of energy, and that will generate standing wave that will connect us to higher dimension. Good. But then you can now see that by having this time-distance relationship, it means that time, by its virtue of default instancy, it will contract the additional measure of light. So, and it is for this reason we always have the measure of light to be c squared. We have it to be c squared. Don't forget that the only way we can measure light speed is by having two-way measurement. And because the reason we have that is for the fact that there is no way we can actually have a clock at initial point where the beam light, where we can have the ejected light beam being ejected to another point where we have another clock, because the virtue of that distance we make the time reading to be different. So the only way we can accurately measure light is just to place the clock at the initial point, then eject the light beam. So there will be a mirror at the end point. That mirror will reflect the light back to that initial point. So the measure that we have when that light reaches the detector will then be divided by 2, and that is the average measure of light speed. But then by the virtue of that light to travel in time, the light constancy must be measured in its multiple. And so that is why we have the two-way measurement, because the other measure of that light constancy will be inversely related to the initial one. And that is why we often have c². So now let's look at this particular diagram for us to be able to know and to be able to, dissect equilateral triangle such that we'll be able to see the constancy to variation relationship. Now, if we have this math format such that we have one at topmost layer, and then the layer beneath the one, we have 1 plus 2. The layer beneath 1 plus 2, we have 1 plus 2 plus 3. The layer beneath that, we have 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. Now you understand the concept. So by having the sum pattern to be like this, we're going to have equilateral triangle, because when you count the constancy of 1 at the extreme left side, you have it in 10 places. And when you count the variation of 1, 2, 3, 4 as you have it, you have that too in 10 places. And then the baseline variation 1, 2, 3 as you have it, you have that too in 10 places. And that makes us to have this to be equilateral triangle. But then don't forget that I have 3 at the extreme left side. I have 6 at the extreme right side base, and then I have 9 at the topmost area. That signifies 3, 6, 9, and that 369, it was proposed by Nikola Tesla. There is reality to this 369 as we have it, but then I will just briefly talk about it briefly. But before I talk about it, let me quickly open our eyes to this, to what we have here. Even though the triangle is equilateral, you can see that we have constancy of 1 at one side, but then we have variation of 1, 2, 3 at the other side. Now, when you look at it, the variation, you can see the variation is more or less like, it's a progression in one difference interval rather. But then you can see clearly here that it varies. But then if you look at what I have written next to it, it says contracting phase by variations. Now let's look at the left side. That says expanding phase by constancy. So what do I mean by that? What we have here is synonymous to what we have in this compacted region. Now, it's synonymous to what we have in this compacted region. Don't forget that I said that in this compacted region, if you put this value in the formula of everything, you can track right from where we have this suspension towards the edge boundary of this energy curvature, and with that you can get to see how we have arbitrary mass being accumulated towards the edge. You understand? So the accumulation of that arbitrary mass will be varied relative to the constant decay value of light, and there will be a point where that will be equal to where the accumulation will be equal to the decaying value, and so we're going to have standing wave. So now when you look at this, you can then get to see that if you dissect this diagram diagonally, you can get to see the contraction by that variation. So now let's look at it. You have this one in 10 places. Then these two diagonally, as you have it in 9 places. The 3 diagonally, you have it in 8 places. 4, you have it in 7 places. 5, you have it in 6 places. And then you can see how it keeps on shrinking towards the 0 point. But then, when you look at this, let's look at the baseline. Don't forget that we have the contraction diagonally to be by variation. But then if you look at this baseline relative to this topmost one that we have it, then you can see that it has been flipped. You can see that this thing has been flipped, and that is the flipping mechanism that we have right at the higher dimension to flip the equilateral triangle as we have it. So now, what do I mean by that? What I meant by that is we have this variation to expand this baseline while the constancy of one contracting this topmost region. So initially we have the variation contracting relative to the expanding constancy, but then now we have the variation expanding relative to the contracting constancy. So basically you can see that flipping mechanism right inside the equilateral triangle. So equilateral triangle is one unique shape that can actually, touch down on a circle, and then by having it to touch down on a circle, we must have suspension, and there will be this speed difference factor. So the speed difference factor is the virtue that makes quantum mechanics to be divergent to classical mechanics. And then you can see that the boundary of quantum mechanics to classical mechanics is this dashed horizontal, which is the trajectory of infinity. That is the boundary. Now we have the feasibility of that unification by having complex system, which is by having transition from substrate dimension to higher dimension. So now there is another thing I want you to know. I said that for you to get the nature of infinity, we must have this suspension. So if you have natural number, anytime you add +1 to it, you have that nature of infinity. But then I said if you want to have the nature of finite measure, we need to say 2n minus 1. But then if you dissect that formula quite alright, you see that it will still get back to odd numbers. Because if you have 2n, you are going to have it to be 2 times 1, for instance. That will give you 2. If you subtract 1 from it, it will give you 1. And that 1 is odd number. Now, if you say 2 times 2, you have 4. If you subtract 1 from it, you have it to be 3. It's odd number. But then, if you even have 2n plus 1, it will still get to that odd number, because 2 times 1 will give you 2. If you add 1 to it, it will be 3, odd number. So now let's look at what we have here by having this sum. We have this sum, and then we realize that the total sum of this pattern, we have it to be 1, 3, 6, 10, 15, 21, 28, 36, 45. Because I have 0 here, this will be 45 as well. Then I flip that to be minus 45, because that point is where we have the flipping mechanism. Now, what do we have in this pattern that is so spectacular? What we have is this. You can see that we have repetition of odd numbers alternating with even numbers. So now 1, 3, odd numbers, 6, 10, even numbers, 15, 21, odd numbers, 28, 36, even numbers, 45, 45, odd numbers. Now we have alternating of odd numbers to even numbers. Don't forget that Schwarzschild solution to general relativity gave us two singularities. So it is ideal for us to have, the duplicates of odd numbers to even numbers as we have it. But then, what this is telling us is that there are some instances where we have suspension, which can be likened to infinity. And then there are some instances where we have genuine contact. So you can see that what we have is synonymous to what I tried to explain earlier here. At higher dimension, we have genuine contact. And then you know that the genuine contact that we have as a result of arbitrary mass water accumulation, which is aligned with the curvature of energy, is what empowers us to have this genuine contact at higher dimension. But then at classical level, you see that we have suspension. So now you can see that is being proved, that we often have genuine contact at one side, then have suspension at other side. So basically it is synonymous to what I said earlier on. So now I want to briefly use this diagram, but I'm not going to talk too much about it. Just want you to know that right from this dashed horizontal line to the topmost region, we have that to be classical realm. And then right from the dashed horizontal line down to the bottom of this energy curvature, we have it to be quantum realm. But then we have suspension, inflationary suspension, and then we have another suspension right inside the black hole, which is known as neutron star suspension. Don't forget that this expanding cosmological space can actually be likened to nuclear fusion, while this contracting black hole phase can also be likened to nuclear fission. Nuclear fission, I cited example of nuclear fission while explaining this, but then the nuclear fusion, that is when you have tritium merging with deuterium, you understand, it will actually form bigger element, which is helium. By the virtue of having bigger element, that would actually cause expansion. But then if we're to now try to dissect what is actually causing cosmological expansion relative to the black hole contraction, we're going to actually focus our beam light on the arbitrary suspensions, or rather let me say arbitrary mass convergence. Arbitrary mass convergence is something that we have which is common to energy and light. Which is common to energy and time. Don't forget that before you can actually measure any speed, before you can actually measure any speed that any object can travel in space relative to time measure, you will have to initiate arbitrary measure as Galileo did. But then you can get to see that the cosmological expansion that we have is as a result of this arbitrary convergence, because the contracting nature of mass accumulation, towards this central intersection of vertical trajectory to horizontal trajectory will cause reaction of that to be this mass convergence as we have it. And that is what will lead to expansion of the cosmological space. But then in the nucleus, we can see that we have the accumulation of that arbitrary mass convergence. We have that to actually contract the nucleus. So we have that to contract the nucleus in the sense that the accumulation is actually towards the compacted region. The accumulation of that mass what is towards the compacted region. So that will actually lead to contraction. Unlike what we have here, we have this because this mass worth, because when you look at this mass worth, it has reaction which is towards this mass convergence, and that reaction will propel this mass accumulation, this real classical mass accumulation, it will propel it towards the trajectory of energy. But then because that is not possible, because of the inverse relationship of time to energy, which is inverse, because of the inverse relationship of time to energy, so energy will suspend the mass worth, even though the mass worth is like trying to travel. It's like trying to travel towards the energy trajectory, and you know what that would result to? It will result to, mass accumulation. And by virtue of mass accumulation, that will actually cause that repulsive force to suspend this classical mass worth. But then, if we look at what we have here, we can get to see that by the virtue of this arbitrary accumulation towards the compacted region would allow for the end region to be expanded while it contracts the head region. The head region will be contracted while so it is the same thing as what we have, and that is why you could actually do experiment with quantum mass worth, for instance electron, in gravitational field, and get to see that it complies with gravitation rules. You understand? But then when you look at what we have, the mass accumulation we serve as the mass accumulation in the nucleus will actually serve as a resistance for this free fall. So we're going to have free fall. The classical gravity, we know it to be free fall. We're going to have that free fall right from this classical arbitrary convergence down to this quantum arbitrary convergence. But from here, we're going to have spontaneous symmetry breaking. And because symmetric nature of light, the constraint of light symmetric nature is being broken. So we're still going to have the symmetric nature of light, but with attachment of variation that will cause that alignment. So now with this, you can get to see that formula of everything is the solution to all these things that we don't know in physics. You understand? And that is why I call this title Faster Than the Speed of Light and Light Speed Limit. So now, it's somehow weird, highly weird, for us to have, or for us to claim that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. It is so weird to have that, and yet we still have another phenomenon which is even being proved, that there is possibility for us to have the faster than the speed of light. You understand? But basically, we can see that the solution as what we have here is for the fact that the faster than the speed of light is only feasible via instant transmission of information. So it is not in any way getting rid of that trade-off as we often have it in quantum mechanics or as we have it in this reality field, by having the suspension of classical mass worth to where it's supposed to be, and then have genuine contact right here. So you can get to see that. Then you know that then even this elongation as we have it here is being justified, because we must bridge this divergent trajectory of classical momentum to quantum momentum. You understand? So basically everything is being solved with formula of everything. Okay, so that is that. But then before I call it a day, I want us to, go through this, what I have here, where, here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. So now this number as they have, each number has its meaning. And we need to know the meaning of every number for us to understand, the nature of number and be able to know how to use them. But then because the interpretation of every number is so, the interpretation is so weird that I just have to title it the spiritual meanings of numbers. But then look at what we have here. Look at this symbol. If you look at what I have here, this is stacking of 9, 6, and 3 together. 6, you have the 6 pointing to the future. Then we have the 9 pointing to the past. We have the 6 pointing to the future. We have the 9 pointing to the past. But then 3 is the connector, right, in the circle of the stacked 9 and 6. So now, 369, Nikola Tesla said that if you want to know the reality, the secret of the universe, you have to think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. But I changed that based on my novel research discovery. I changed that to, you have to think in terms of mass worth, in terms of mass, reality, and energy. So the 6 represents energy, 9 represents mass worth, then 3 represents reality. So what do I mean by that? When you look at this time energy wave model, you can see that we have this vertical trajectory to be the static and undulating field, which is the field of reality. We have this expanding cosmological space to be the worth space. So I said you should think in terms of worth, reality, and energy. So the cosmological space where we have expansion, we could call that the phase of worth. And then we can call this contracting phase of black hole to be the phase of energy. Why do we have to call it the space of energy? The moment we have the positron from the higher dimension being injected into substrate dimension, that will energize momentum towards the core singularity of black hole. And that will make energy trajectory to be ahead of time's trajectory. And that is why we could have decaying of mass worth. So by having that, it is so difficult for us to say that this is what is causing the decay. Don't forget that we have the catalyst to be from the higher dimension. And so the phenomenon that we have right inside the black hole is not the kind of phenomenon that we have right inside the expanding space of the cosmology, or the expanding space of cosmos. And I must also tell you that the mass worth that we have in the Big Bang singularity is different from the mass worth that we have in the black hole singularity. What we have here is known as energy density, while what we have in the black hole singularity is known as mass worth or mass density. So now we must always have this difference for us to continuously have momentum. So now, when we now look at this, you can see that in the cosmological space, we could have cause-effect phenomenon. Cause-effect, which means that cause must precede effect. But in the black hole, we have effect-cause phenomenon because effect precedes the cause. You understand? So that is what we have, though it may be so weird, but that is the reality. So now let's look at this. Number one is symbolic representation of constancy, elongation virtue, and expansion facilitator of symmetric trajectories of the universe. Ponder over what I've just said. You will see that that is the true nature of number one. Number two, numera of balanced instantiation, action and reaction symmetries with adjustable asymmetric confinement of the universe. That's number two for you. So we often have things double in the universe. We have two singularities, we have two hands, we have two nostrils, we have two eyes, we have two legs. So we often have things, we have it in double. So we have classical mechanics and we have quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is the inverse of classical mechanics, in case you don't know. So now, basically what that is telling us is that before anything can even be measured in the universe, it has to be in double. So if you have a point in the universe, there is no way you can define that point. There is no way, unless you have an inverse of that point, which is inversely related to it, that you can say this point is initial point while the other point is the later point.